This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
Wow, it's a wonderful turnout on a freezing cold November evening, and I think that's to the credit of the Enneagram, which is being popularized all over the world and certainly here in Ashland. So welcome to a smidgen of Enneagram teachings and my particular interest in the Enneagram teachings these days. By way of introduction, I live in Mount Shasta. I come up here all the time. I've been studying the Enneagram for almost 20 years, about 13 years intensely. I started a business a few years ago called the Enneagram Center of Mount Shasta and travel quite a bit to teach it. There's not a lot of people in Mount Shasta, so I usually teach elsewhere and then come home and rest. I'm also working on a book that relates to the topic we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. Because it's only 2 hours, I don't want to go too much into myself or even the history of the Enneagram. I want to talk about the system as a whole very briefly and how I think that there's a lot more to it than you often read in Enneagram books and articles, and even might hear about at the International Enneagram Association conferences. Before I start, I'd like a show of hands, if you will. How many of you know something about the Enneagram? Wow. How many of you know your type? It's Ashland. It's incredible. Yeah. Wow. How many of you have attended an Enneagram workshop? Wow. How many of you attended one of my workshops? 2 or 3. This is the third time, at least, I've presented here on Tuesday nights. I did a presentation on the Enneagram and one on the Findhorn community, where I used to live. And I've also taught here once or twice. And I also teach at the Hidden Springs Wellness Center. So I figure since she was plugging other places and people, I'll plug. Hidden Springs is a great place to attend workshops. And of course, you know, like most of the presenters, I'm here to teach you something about the Enneagram and also plug myself a little bit because I do lead workshops here 2 or 3 times a year, and I hope to be leading more. My co-facilitator is named Marla, and she's here. Would you stand up, Marla? Marla helps put on, you know, whatever Enneagram workshops I've been doing for the last couple of years, and she knows a fair bit about it. I guess there's going to be a break at 8 o'clock, so I'm going to go on for about 45, 50 minutes. We'll take a 10-minute break. Those of you who want to leave can leave. I'd like to ask that people come back after those 10 minutes if you're going to spend the second half of the evening here, just so we're not, you know, trying to pull the group together again. And I think I have to finish at 9 o'clock at the very latest. I'm going to read the presentation description. And the reason I'm doing this is I recently did a workshop with Houston Smith, the great religious studies scholar, and he read his own blurb in the Esalen catalog. And he said that he does this all the time because he believes in truth in advertising when it comes to workshops, seminars, presentations. And he doesn't like it when he shows up and then people talk on a completely different subject. So, and of course, you know, workshop presenters work very hard at this. So, the Enneagram is an ancient and sacred diagram that describes 9 distinct and fundamentally different personality or character types. And I'm going to put those on the projection screen in a minute. Ennea is Greek for 9, and gram means point or letter. It's the same root as grammar, which means a system of letters. Study and practice of this profound and powerful system helps one to identify and move beyond non-productive habits of body, speech, and mind, increases compassion for self and others, and effectively integrates psychological and spiritual life. Right? That's a blurb I worked very hard at for all my advertising. The last one is very important, the last point. Effectively integrates psychological and spiritual life. Okay? What we see so often in spiritual communities, with spiritual teachers, and in spiritual teachings, is a splitting between, the sort of, we could say the medical and psychological domains of life, and then the higher transpersonal or spiritual domains, rather than seeing them as a continuum and working at integrating them. And the Enneagram very much works from the ground up, and prevents what is now called spiritual bypassing, where people have high levels of spiritual awareness but haven't worked on the lower levels very much, right? And then you get the phenomena we talk about, in the Bay Area, enlightened jerks, enlightened neurotics, enlightened assholes. Can I say that on camera? I know, it's okay. I have no reputation to sully, believe me. I'm independently employed. There's an international Enneagram Association and dozens of books, articles, and websites outlining the basics of what has become known as the Enneagram of personality. And yet, I believe more esoteric information and wisdom is contained within the symbol than is commonly reported and discussed in the available literature and trainings. This presentation will explore how the Enneagram can be used as a map, guide, and tool for entrance into the journey of initiation and what the ancients called the mysteries. Okay? So the Enneagram surfaced in the 60s and 70s, became popularized in the 80s and 90s when books started to be written about, and in many ways was co-opted by the psychotherapy movement, by psychologists, social workers, therapists, nurses, and other people. And many Enneagram teachers feel that the system got skewed a little too much to the psychological. And so one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, reading about, writing about, is how the Enneagram symbol, even though we don't know where it comes from, right? We don't really know which tradition it came from. Gurdjieff himself said that it came from outside any recognized religious tradition. He named 4, if you read In Search of the Miraculous, the Middle Eastern, Judeo-Christian, Egyptian, and the Indo-Tibetan areas. And he said the Enneagram was never associated with any recognizable stream of religiosity that we know of, right? So what's the purpose of the diagram? I mean, this is great because it looks like 60, 70, 80% of you know something about it already. Many of you already know your type or think you know your type, so I don't need to go too much into that. If you came here thinking you were going to get a detailed phenomenology of the 9 types in 1.5 to 2 hours, it's not going to happen. I am going to put them on the board and talk a little bit about it. But you can find out the basic information in any Enneagram book. Okay? And I have some books for sale up here at the break or afterwards. I'm quite happy to stay for at least 15 or 20 minutes after 9 o'clock. I have the Essential Enneagram and the Enneagram in Love and Work over here for sale, $10 and $15. Okay? I also have a sign-up sheet in the back if you want to be on my mailing list or list for upcoming workshops. So this is the diagram without anything on it. Obviously, Ennea means 9, and there's 9 points. There's evidence to show that a lot of consciousness raising can happen just by meditating on the diagram. That's not spoken about too much either. It's a kind of a mandala or yantra. You've probably seen the Sri Chakra and other yantras from India that are supposed to represent the embodiment of deities, the Divine Mother, the Sri Yantra, and there's Kali yantras and Shiva yantras. Okay, it's sort of a specialty of the Indo-Tibetan region. So the first thing I want to say is, what the heck is the diagram? What does it do? What does it shift in consciousness by looking at it? That's the first thing to think about. Notice that the diagram's been opened up at the bottom, so even though you have what could be 3 equilateral triangles, you do have this gap at the bottom because you have the circle, 9 points, you have a hexagram, right? 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, plus the 9 at the top. And then you've got the central triangle with a point in the middle. So that's the first thing I would like to say. The second thing is, how many of you have studied anything about the mystery traditions, or have a sense of what I mean when I say the mysteries? Raise your hand. It's Ashland, so I'm sure at least half the population, right? So I want to speak about that tonight, because that doesn't get spoken about very much in conjunction with the Enneagram. Again, the Enneagram's been popularized and to some extent watered down and overly therapized and psychologized in our culture. If you study the ancient world, there were mystery traditions all over the place. Some of them large and well-known, like the Eleusinian mysteries. There was also, the Orphic and Dionysian mysteries, the cult of Isis, the Mithraic mysteries. And there's been an enormous amount of great scholarship and speculation out on that in the last 20 to 30 years. Scholarly as well as speculative in terms of being intellectually and spiritually open and provocative. There were always mystery schools associated with great temples. There was always, the exoteric spiritual teachings, and I mean in all the religious traditions. And then, not in all the temples, but in many temples you had initiates. They could be Eastern Orthodox Christian initiates or, Jewish initiates teaching Kabbalistic theory and practices. Zoroastrian, Egyptian, Indian mystery schools that were very often private or secret, right? Even regular temple goers might not know that there were small groups meeting in special rooms at special times. There have also been mystery schools that were not connected to large temples. Gurdjieff, how many of you know anything about the Russian Armenian mystic and explorer Gurdjieff? Raise your hand so I have a sense. Okay. How many of you have seen the movie Meetings with Remarkable Men or read the book? God, you got to love Ashland, right? It's incredible. How many of you read the book In Search of the Miraculous? Ouspensky's recordings of, okay. Well, Gurdjieff traveled all around the Middle East looking for mystery schools. Small, large, mainstream, way occult or esoteric. And seeing what sort of, philosophies and practices they embodied. Even, teachers we're most familiar with, like Jesus, apparently, he didn't even have, a cave, any particular cave or place he went to teach the special high teachings. He taught the multitudes according to the New Testament in parables, and then he taught everybody else, he taught his inner group of disciples. They'd go off into a field in the Galilee or something, and he would teach them about the kingdom of God and how the kingdom is within and, all sorts of other juicy things, and presumably gave them spiritual transmissions as well. So the Enneagram, I think, does something very powerful in consciousness and perhaps more and more and more in society. Because I have a lot of friends who are Enneagram teachers. I've been to 4 international Enneagram conferences in the last 7 years. And when you put the diagram up on the board or you give somebody an Enneagram book and you constellate a group of people to look at this mystical, magical symbol that has so much encoded in it, and I purposely put a blank screen up here for the moment, you constellate a mystery school. And I think that the Enneagram, my intuition, I don't think, my intuition is the Enneagram might have been given to the world, let's say in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and then disseminated through Central Asia and the West, and eventually, like so many hidden or esoteric teachings since the 60s, really become an open secret because we need it, and because mystery schools are going to look very different in the Aquarian age. They're going to be out in the open without the fancy robes. They may not even have an obvious teacher or a guru at the center of, what an ashram is the Hindu name, the Sanskrit name for a large mystery school with an incarnate master at the center of it, like a seed crystal. But mystery schools are changing, and I lived at the Findhorn community, as I mentioned earlier, from 1983 to 1986. And at Findhorn, we very self-consciously said that it was a mystery school of a sort, or a university of light. Didn't look like it when you went there. You were allowed to eat whatever you wanted and dress however you wanted. Once Peter Caddy left, David Spangler first, and then Peter Caddy and everybody, there wasn't even any obvious spiritual figurehead at Findhorn. And yet there were all these spiritual principles being inculcated and at least attempted to be practiced at Findhorn, right? Co-creation with nature, working with the invisible beings, the devas and the elementals. That's a kind of a mystery school. Now, we didn't have the Enneagram at Findhorn in the 70s, 80s, but 60s, 70s, 80s. But something happens when you start pondering the mysteries of the Enneagram. And I don't know if it's true or not, but my thesis is when you get a group of people together to look at the diagram and go deeply into it, you start talking about the soul versus the acquired personality, low-level fixated or neurotic patterns of behavior versus opening up to the higher centers of intelligence and having, soul contact and soul qualities coming through, which naturally leads to the question of reincarnation or transmigration, right? Whether we've been here before, and karma, and the topic that was key to the greater mysteries, because the mystery schools were always separated into the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries, and I believe the Enneagram diagram potentially embodies both, right? If you do enough work with it or you hang out in a group of people who are diving deeply into it with the teacher, you might even get to some of the greater mysteries. The greater mysteries always had at their core what happens to the soul after it leaves the body, the death process, the invisible worlds, maybe even parallel worlds like the Devic kingdom that we talked about at Findhorn, the Devas and the elementals, the builders of form, the seven rays, for those of you who study theosophy, Alice Bailey. One of the things you sometimes hear Enneagram teachers mention, did I mention this 2 weekends ago, Marla, the whole journey of the soul thing? I don't think so. There's a lot of esoteric mathematics and geometry in the Enneagram. And I'm not going to go into all the repeating numbers and things tonight. But one of the things people notice first is that the number 9 cross-culturally always represents initiation. Or initiation is always symbolized with the number 9. Interesting, Navaratri, the 9 nights of the goddess in India, right? Dussehra. The Eleusinian mysteries, there was 9 nights during the major festival, on and on and on. There's various esoteric reasons you can read about in theosophical literature and elsewhere about why 9 is associated with the initiatory process. And initiation, I'm using the theosophical definition, which is a graded series of expansions of consciousness, right? Self-initiated, right? Everybody's going to evolve naturally eventually, but if you want to speed that process up, cut down on your own suffering and the suffering of other people, through good fortune and spiritual aspiration, hard work, you may meet some masters, beings, more evolved than you are, encounter teachings, and you may be able to bootstrap yourself up more quickly to higher levels of consciousness. And that's what the initiatory process is, regardless of how many grades of consciousness we talk about. Usually there's 7, but sometimes 9 or 5 or 3. Well, so that's the number 9. Okay, there's a 10th point, sort of an invisible 0 or 10th point at the middle, like the Kabbalistic tree of life. This would be the Ein Sof. So if you notice here, if you think of the journey starting maybe here, and then you enter into form here, you have 9. And then if you go this way, you have the journey of involution, right? This is sort of the Gnostic journey of, the divine spark or the monad coming in. You see, we're already talking about mystical, magical things here, right? We've already constituted a mystery school. I mean, how many times do you go to a school or a university and talk about the constitution of the human being, where we came from, where we're going, initiation, reincarnation? So the room gets really still when you talk about these things. Maybe, death, what happens when you die, right? The different levels of reality, all of that stuff. This is what was taught. It's education for the soul. So this, so if you go 9, you have 9 times 2 is 18, 3 is 27, 4 is 36, 5, 9 times 5, 45. So this would be, involution. And then it reverses, 54, 63, 9 times 8, 72, 9 times 9, 81. And then you come back here. So this is evolution, or what's known in esoteric studies as the path of return. By the way, you might want to, if you want to write any of this stuff down, I'm going to erase boards if I have to. I decided to do a whiteboard, not a butcher paper. So write it down now because it won't come back tonight. Which was another feature of mystery schools. You know, you had to pay attention, you had to listen. It wasn't like things were going to be repeated necessarily. I mean, you know, you might be burned at the stake or hung or drowned or something if, you know, you got caught in the 4th or 5th century studying Gnosticism or, you know, or the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. I mean, it's a pretty amazing time we live in at the beginning of the 21st century, at least in the Western world, that we can talk about all of this and be pretty assured that, unless there's some psycho in the audience, we're not, you know, neither the state nor the dominant religion can tell us we can't have an open mind and talk about these things, right? Any questions about this? You're free to raise your hand during the course of this. And yes?
Could you just do the number thing again?
It's just 9 times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It just starts here. You know, 18, 27, 36, 45. And then it reverses, 54, 63, 72, 81. Right? There's other things I could show you in this area, but this is the simplest and the one that people get, you know, right away. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Enneagram, and as I do, I'm going to weave it into the story of mystery schools and initiation. Okay? A lot of you already know something about the Enneagram, and I have to say I'm going to talk a little bit more to you because this is not really a beginning talk on the Enneagram. If it were, I would have said introduction to the Enneagram. So for those of you who don't know much, then just take it in and play catch up a little bit. Maybe buy a book and you know, come to another workshop later on. So this is the diagram, and then this is the diagram with numbers. I know many of you know this. Okay. Again, the numbers always stay the same. The diagram stays the same. The names stay pretty much the same, although depending on the teacher, the names change a little bit. You know, the names are just trait descriptors that are connected to the type. So 0.8 is sometimes called the boss, for example, or 1 is called the reformer, 2 is called the server or the helper. Okay, don't ever be confused about the names. Different teachers just tweak it a little bit differently to emphasize a different character trait. But they all tie in to the archetypal configurations of energy that we know as the Enneagram. Now the Enneagram, again, this connects to my talk tonight. The Enneagram has been overwhelmingly co-opted by psychology, and then we use it to focus on human character structure. However, the Enneagram also describes the macrocosm as well as the microcosm, okay? And the flow of energy through time and space. It's truly fractal in nature. Fractal meaning that the same structure and patterns exist on different levels of reality and different magnitudes of reality, okay? So as you meditate on the diagram, you know, the tendency is to reduce the mysteries of the cosmos down to our particular species, Homo sapiens, and our particular problem sets as neurotic, you know, creatures crawling on the face of the planet, you know, with our patterns of body, speech, and mind. But the Enneagram is actually much vaster. Okay? Part of connecting the Enneagram back into a deep spiritual tradition or situating it within a larger context, I believe is expanding it beyond just human neuroses and character structure. You know, opening it up to the mysteries of birth and death and larger cycles. So, there's recently been some very good articles out that talk about the fact that in many spiritual traditions, for example, Tibetan Buddhism. Has anybody studied in the Tibetan tradition? Dzogchen, Mahamudra teachings. They talk about outer, inner, and secret levels of the teachings. Now, in this case, they're Tantric Buddhist. But there have been some good articles out recently about how that, that schema can be applied to the Enneagram. And I think the most useful way to do it is to think about this, right? On the grossest or most external level, you have the outer circle and the 9 types. And people call this the Enneagram of structure or form. When spirit gets managed into form, it takes on shape, right? Dog, a cat, a tree, a human being, but then even male, female, and gender differences. The Enneagram is mostly studied in terms of character type. And there are 9 recognizable character types, and we're about to talk about that. Okay, but that's still the grossest, most external level. That would be the outer level. You can call that, I'm running out of room here. That's the Enneagram of structure or form. The inner level is the hexagram, 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, with 9 up here as what we call a repeating shock point. That's a hexagram. Hexagram is looks like that, right? And then you have the triangle this way. And if you take the unity of the cosmos and divide it by 7, and those of you who've studied esoteric mathematics and geometry know that everything's built on the law of 1, 3, 7, 9. If you study theosophical teachings, Alice Bailey, you get 0.142857, and it repeats endlessly. And that's where we get 142857, which is the flow of energy around the Enneagram. Okay. So the hexagram describes what Gurdjieff and Uspensky and other people called the Enneagram of process. That's not so much to do with how energy congeals or coalesces or configures, as much as what happens when energy flows, right? Because we always have that dialectic of being static versus being fluid, right? And if you read Enneagram studies by John Bennett, who is a student of the Gurdjieff work, and A.G.E. Wallace's books, or A.G.E. Blake's book, The Intelligent Enneagram. There's a lot of talk about that, because now you start to get really esoteric or occult. You start being able to work with energy and force and track the flow of a creative project, for example. Or if you retroflect it back to your own body, mind, the flow of your own life and your ability to create what you want in your life. That's the inner. And then finally you have the central triangle with the point at the middle. This here, which you can think of as body, mind, spirit, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. Just for those of you who can't see, it's just the triangle 963 with the point at the middle, and that refers to the central triad, to both the 3 lower centers of intelligence, the higher center of intelligence, the structure of the soul, and the point at the center, of course, going back to the bindu and the sort of realization of the unicity or oneness of the universe. So that would be the deepest level. We call that the Enneagram of realization or enlightenment, right? Maybe not permanent, maybe just a flash of that, cosmic consciousness or an LSD trip, or nobody does that anymore. Scratch that. Yeah. Although all the Republicans are leaving, so it's going to be more free in the future, hopefully. We won't talk about the election, but it was wonderful. Okay. All righty. I'm going to put these up just for the people who don't know that much about it. Again, the Enneagram on the outer level is a model. This is the most popular common usage. When you go to Starbucks downtown on the plaza and you start talking about the Enneagram, most people will think of it as a personality typology with 9 different worldviews or types. Each type has distinct patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. Types identified by the focus of your attention to and how you direct energy. So we already know that it's a very profound spiritual theory and practice, right? Because all higher spiritual practices have to do with managing attention and working with energy. Underlying each type are fundamental beliefs about what's needed for survival and satisfaction. We all have to have an Enneagram type. Okay, it seems like that's the way God made us, but we're not supposed to identify with it too much. in the process of development, the higher qualities of our essential nature, our spiritual self, our essence, our soul, go into the background. This is just basic Enneagram theory by way of background. So personality or character structure from the Enneagram perspective is all the characteristic and habitual behaviors of somebody. In Enneagram terms, the 9 particular patterns into which attention's organized and corresponding mental and emotional preoccupations which are embodied in daily life. Okay? Some of you may not be able to read it so clearly in the background. If you know your type, you know a lot about yourself. This is all the basic stuff. And you know where your attention tends to go, especially under stress, when you're not thinking about it. Those of you who know your type, usually people wake up to type by noticing certain things about themselves, including what I call a problem set. Either a problem set is where you tend to get stuck in life, or where your energy naturally wants to go, where your values and behaviors are. So if you're a 2, the 2, 3, 4, the emotional types. So 2s tend to focus on other people's needs rather than their own. They're empathic, sensitive people who are looking for love and attention, love and approval through helping other people. 3s, the performer. These are those busy, energetic type A people who are performing for love and approval, right? And 4s, the romantic, or used to be called the tragic romantic, longing for what's missing, distant, or unavailable, right? All of the types have, very wonderful positive sides to them. 2s are empathic and loving and, are there for your needs. 3s are very efficient and productive. 4s, end up creating a lot of art and beauty in the world, sublimating pain and suffering into, art. I'm going over this really quickly, just a thumbnail sketch, right? Because tonight's actually, again, about the intersection of esoteric studies and mystery tradition and the Enneagram. I want to sort of plant some seeds in your mind as you hopefully go out and study the Enneagram more. 5, 6, 7 over here. So these are what we call the emotional types. These are the mental types. These are the body types. These relate to what we call the 3 centers of intelligence, right? Thinking, feeling, and sensing. There's also 3 higher centers of intelligence. And this does not get much attention in the Enneagram world, not as much as you would expect. But I hope it'll get more and more as people meditate, do high-level practices, master the basics of the system, discover their type. So we have the lower centers of intelligence, okay, which I just said are, the emotional over here, the mental, emotional. We all have all these centers inside of us, of course, and, the somatic or body, right? But we also have higher centers, and we know this from Sufism and other mystical practices, that when we relax and disidentify with what in occult studies is called the lower threefold personality, we have these higher faculties. So in Theosophy, I'm very familiar with the Alice Bailey teachings and the Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled. The terms Blavatsky used were Atma, Buddhi. These are also used in Alice Bailey. And Manas. So this would be higher mind, the higher emotional center, and the higher physical center. And these are actually, those 3 together are what's called the spiritual triad. These are the higher faculties. But they can only be reached by relaxing through and disidentifying from our habitual knee-jerk body-mind reactions, what's called in yoga psychology the body-mind. We tend to talk in terms of character structure. Atma, Buddhi, Manas. So part of working with the Enneagram, part of the deeper mysteries of the Enneagram, I'm sort of stepping forward in time and space for many of you who don't even know the Enneagram or know very little about it. But I'm trying to give you an idea of where Enneagram studies can potentially take us, which is much more than just playing parlor games with type. Oh, I'm a 2, I'm a 3, I'm a 1. You're going to hear that in, at the co-op here and Starbucks and, the Ashland Bakery and, I went to Pipon's tonight, the great new Mexican restaurant. You hear people do that, especially in the first few months and years of their Enneagram studies. But what happens is that ends up becoming, what Ken Wilber rightly calls a horizontal typology, right? Rather than adding the vertical component. Vertical component, we're into initiation, the mystery schools, high-level spiritual development that comes from meditation, study with great teachers, things like that. That's actually moving up, the hierarchy of being, what Uspensky would call levels of being, rather than just adding to our knowledge and understanding. What happens is we can add knowledge up to a certain level, up to sort of our level of perceptivity or understanding according to our level of being. At least that's what they used to teach in the mystery schools, right? So, I might know more than somebody on the street. The Dalai Lama knows more than I do. The Buddha knows more than the Dalai Lama. On and on and on. I mean, it's a great chain of being, or what's called the hierarchy, actually, in esoteric studies. Hierarchy has had a very bad rep, in the New Age, but there's horizontal connection and typology and relatedness, but the vertical dimension's there too. It never went away. So what we're trying to do with Enneagram studies these days is somehow integrate both the vertical level of spiritual development versus this level right here and now. Marla, I know Marla, so I know she's a different type than I am. And, sir, you might be a different type than both of us. And the Enneagram, I always say, is more like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. It really shouldn't be vertical. It should be horizontal. And the types all sit equidistant from each other. It's not better to be a 9, a 2, a 1, or a 7. That alone is democratic, liberating, right? There's an enormous amount of freedom in not expecting other people to act exactly like you do or see the world through the same set of filters. And don't get me wrong, that level, which is sort of social, political, psychological, is tremendously important. I know in my own family, Marla's heard me say this, I have 6 people in my family, every one of us is a different character type, and we're all big characters too. And, knowing that my dad's a 5 and my mother was a 9 and my brother's a 4, really has, and everybody now knows the Enneagram, thanks to me. And it's been enormously liberating because we're not expecting other people to be other than who they are. That's very, very important, okay? The Enneagram, I'm going to throw this piece of esoteric knowledge in. The Enneagram, you can also map on the constitution of, well, we used to say the constitution of man, but can't do that anymore. So the constitution of human beings. Have any of you read The Secret Doctrine or parts of it? Any of you read any theosophical literature? A few people. It's okay. You won't get burnt at the stake in Ashland. You can raise your hand. It's not just Blavatsky, but there's, reams, and Rudolf Steiner would be in the theosophical and anthroposophical tradition. Plenty of other, great teachers like that. Blavatsky said that, I'm going to erase this and start again. In terms of esoteric studies, the human being is considered to be made up of 3, thank you. 3 fundamental parts, and they can be mapped onto the Enneagram because any realm of what Gurdjieff called objective knowledge, you can find a way to map it onto the Enneagram. So it's the monad or the divine spark, or it's called the Atma or the Atman in yoga psychology, the soul or the causal body, and then the personality, or what's called the lower threefold personality, which is, the monkey meat we drag around. This, the body mind that you all take to yoga classes in Ashland and Qigong and all those things, right? So mystery schools didn't focus directly on personality, and really the Enneagram shouldn't either past a certain point. The mystery schools tended to focus on the level of soul. The lesser mysteries were about encountering the basic teachings, purification, catharsis, learning ethical behavior, right? 10 Commandments, in the Jewish, Judeo-Christian tradition, Christ's higher teachings, things like that. Then the greater mysteries were more here and here, right? Learning to open up to divine grace, the three upper worlds, developing siddhis or kriyas, higher powers. Learning also through the purification and strengthening practices, you learn to hold more light and love in your body-mind. So you didn't fry out, burn out, get sick, go psychotic, right? So you could learn to be in the world and not of the world, find your true initiatory level, and in the words of my teacher, Helen Palmer, my Enneagram teacher, be of some use on the planet, right? And be able to radiate more love and light, right? Or in the words of the Alice Bailey great invocation, right? Let light and love and power restore the planet on Earth. Well, we have to be able to embody and channel, radiate some measure of light, love, and power. So again, the monad, the soul, and the personality, this can be mapped onto the Enneagram, right? Here you could think of this as God or spirit. How are we doing for time? I've got a few minutes. Are there any questions about this before I talk more about the Enneagram of personality? I'm going to finish this. Okay, well, just hold them for a second. I'll go through here. So these types I mentioned, 5, 6, 7 are the mental types. So for those people who are 5s, they tend to be bookish intellectual types. The energy sublimates up into the head. Their placement of attention goes, the romantic goes to what's missing. So they have this longing, it's like Meryl Streep in French Lieutenant's Woman waiting, the red hair and the rain and everything. Or in Out of Africa, waiting for Robert Redford to come back. For 5s, it's what's going to intrude upon my time and space. I want peace, quiet. I want the ability to think clearly, right? To contact with Descartes, who is probably a 5 or a 6, called clear and distinct ideas. For 6s, these types all have issues with fear. These types all have issues with grief, shame, unworthiness. These types all sort of sell out for love on, in terms of normal daily actions. These types sort of sell out for love in a certain way by performing for love, by giving for love, by being artsy-fartsy for love, so to speak. By unique self-presentation, being dramatic, amping up the environment through color, passion, and drama for love. These types over here have issues with, anxiety, insecurity. Life is a shaky proposition, as my father, who's a 5, always says. So, the 5 strategy is go up into your head, try to read books, sort of like, that old thing of, 2 people go to heaven, one of them is a scholar, and St. Peter gives them a choice. You can either enter the pearly gates or you can read books about heaven, and the scholar would rather read about heaven than go in. So that's one of the best definitions of a 5 I can give. 6s are the Woody Allen type, big eyes, sort of doe in the headlights energy of like, oh my gosh, life is, shaky proposition. So, they don't know that they're placing their attention on what could either abandon them or attack them and make them feel anxious, insecure. So, their issue is really abandonment or being attacked by, big, mean authority figures. So it's the Woody Allen point. He's a great 6. And 7, my favorite type. The epicure. Point 5 is called the thinker sometimes, like Rodin's the thinker. Point 6, we used to call the devil's advocate because they tend to argue and take the other side of whatever you present. But a lot of 6s said, we really don't want the devil in our name. So Helen took it out. She calls it the loyal skeptic, which embodies the contradictory nature of the type. For 7s, the epicure, they're also a fear type. They also are a head type, but it doesn't always appear that way because they run away from fear by going into the future, plans, ideas. They're busy connecting the dots and being endlessly high and stimulated. Fun, play, sex, travel. Hugh Hefner, the founder of Playboy magazine, is a 7. What a life that guy's had. But it's just like life's a bowl of cherries. Everything is always up and high and pleasurable. The complete opposite of 4s. 4s wallow in the dark side. 7s wallow in the light side. We call them flight to the light. Flight to the light. Okay. Ram Dass is a 7. Ram Dass, he's always synthesizing some system, and he's always happy and smiling and very resilient. Cher is a 7. We say, you can't kill Cher. She always comes back with, somehow reframes whatever she's gone through. And I know the 7 type really well. Point 8 is the boss or the protector. 8s are big, strong people who are protecting their inner, weak, vulnerable sides by being sort of large, going to excess. Very, very embodied, tend to be power brokers. They have issues around power and control. What am I missing, Marla? Yeah. Donald Rumsfeld's probably an 8. But so is Martin Luther King Jr. So Saddam Hussein, Muhammad Ali. Boxers, football players are often 8s, big, strong people who, jockey for power and control in the world. A lot of lawyers, corporate executives, politicians are 8s. Khrushchev was an 8, banging his shoe on the table of the UN. Lyndon Johnson was an 8. Like when he picked his dog? Like picked his dog up, by the... But on the other hand, 8s can be soft and fuzzy, and you really want 8s as friends because, boy, will they protect you if anybody, wants to harm you in any way. Howard Dean is a good 8. Yeah, he's a great 8. Sort of warm, soft, fuzzy 8. 9s up at the top of the Enneagram. They're body types, but they've sort of gone asleep to their body energy and anger. The Dalai Lama's a 9, sort of warm, soft, fuzzy people. Mr. Rogers was a 9. Marla's heard me sing this song many times, right? I love this song because it embodies the energy of 9, right? Because 9s like to be comfortable. They don't like to be pushed, so their energy and attitude is sort of like, should I sing it? It's a wonderful day in the neighborhood. Won't you be my neighbor? Yeah, but they actually can have a lot of. 1 second, let me do one, and then they actually have a lot of energy bottled up, and when they start to release it, they can get very big and strong and have a huge impact on the world. Eisenhower was a 9. Yeah, Carl Jung was probably a 9. Carl Rogers, humanistic psychology, was probably a 9. Okay. 1's the perfectionist. So these types all have issues with existence versus non-existence, being present, boundaries, limits, priorities. We call BLP, boundaries, limits, priorities. Anger and aggression, modulating anger, staying in touch with the life force, but not acting it out punitively with violence or anger, or too much big energy that scares people. These people, it's not that everybody can't get angry sometimes, but this is central to the character type. These people all have issues with anxiety and fear, insecurity, grief, shame, unworthiness over here. Okay. 1s, these are the perfectionist, the reformer, the judge. These are people whose solution to the fact that life is painful and often there seems to be mistakes and imperfections, at least according to their own superego, is what they do is the energy rises up and they start judging other people and themselves for how imperfect life is, how things could be improved, they could be better. So they get sort of detail-oriented, Virgoian, if you know astrology, focused. They can be very focused and productive, But on the other hand, they don't realize at the beginning of the journey that they're being driven by unconscious anger and resentment. They're so busy trying to be good and perfect and right. How come everybody else isn't all the time, right? Well, we don't all have an extra lobe on our brain, telling us what we should or shouldn't do. But ones have a little extra superego there. Not because they necessarily had more laid upon them, but because they identified more with that inner critic, right? So they're being run by that. So these are the 9 types. I'm going to try to actually stay on time. We have about 2 or 3 more minutes before 8 o'clock. This is the basic Enneagram, skating on the surface, that you have been reading about, on the internet and in newspapers and magazine articles and maybe, what's the newspaper? Ashland Good Tidings? There's, right? Gangaji and Eli have been teaching the Enneagram the last few years. Around Ashland, there's a few other teachers.
What do you think they
Oh my gosh, look at that. Well, we know what they are because they talk about it. Eli's an 8 and Gangaji's a 4. Yeah. That was cool. Where's the little red light that goes up like the Academy Awards? Okay. You can just smile, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. So again, in terms of, fitting the Enneagram into deeper or broader spiritual awareness and tying it into, and I'll talk more about this after 8:10, 8:15, the mystery tradition. So this is the outer level, right? The outer level, the level of the circle here. And by the way, you notice the arrows. The Enneagram is not really a static symbol. Actually, Gurdjieff said it was an image of perpetual motion. And it was the philosopher's stone. That's why at the beginning I sort of suggested that you meditate on it a little bit. That somehow implanting the Enneagram diagram, I'm not the CIA or anything here, I'm not trying to give you a subliminal, but by implanting the Enneagram diagram in your psyche and working with it a bit, amazing things happen. There's a sense of integration, sort of an alchemical transformation and integration that can take place. There's a reason why it goes 963, 963, 963, 142, 857. And part of meditating on the Enneagram, studying it, working with yourself, is learning about the relationship between the static point at the center, the triangle, and the hexagram. And how, you've got this pulsing at point 1 of just divinity, from what's called the central spiritual sun in occult psychology. And then you've got this triad here. Everything is based on the law of 3. That's why Father, Son, I'm Jewish, so I'm not trying to make you Catholic, but that's why Father, Son, Holy Ghost is so important in Catholic theology and dogma, right? It's what in the Gurdjieff tradition they called cultivating triadic mentation, like holding the awareness and thinking through, and Hegel talked about it, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? That actually opens up the consciousness. Things aren't one way, one point, one way we call fundamentalism. Right? You have a line, well, you've got some movement, but eventually that movement goes in one direction. And then you've got the two ends of the line, so now you've got either or. So now you have at least the choice of 2, right? That's better than my way or the highway, sort of, the fundamentalist axiom. Or my way or, the gallows or something. But then if you open it up to triadic ways of being, then you've got a flow. Right? Then you've got the Divine Mother in the tarot. You've got the goddess. You've got 3. You've got a flow of energy which potentially, it's closed at first, but eventually opens up, eventually gives birth to something, which actually, some people say this symbolically represents the birth canal. Right? It also can represent, conscious being is up here, this is non-being or the abyss down here, but out of the abyss eventually comes light, comes, a new birth, whether a baby or a new philosophy or form. So I want you to be thinking about the outer, inner, and secret levels of the Enneagram. We'll take a 10-minute break, get some fresh air, get some tea, and we'll come back and talk more about this. Thank you. Some questions before I continue. Does anybody have any questions about anything I've said so far? Speak now or wait at least a half an hour. I know there was one or two out there. Maybe the people left. Yes? Where? So the way we're going to do it is Björk, Björk what? Okay. Björk's going to run like Phil Donahue used to do and hand the microphone so that it shows up on the recording.
In terms of those number sequences that you showed, that you pointed out in terms of the 9, 27, 36 around, what's the significance of that?
It doesn't have any significance when it comes to the individual personality types. It's more on the macrocosmic level of what many of us believe the Enneagram is for and what it's mapping out, which again, I said, represents the involution and evolution of the soul's journey, or the monad's journey, the divine spark, the wheel of life, as we reincarnate over and over again. It would be a symbolic mapping of that process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I was hoping for something more specific, but yeah.
That's pretty specific. Again, most people when they talk about the Enneagram at first, they just look at the 9 personality types. But I'm trying to give you a sense that there's a lot more in the diagram. In a sense, that's the thesis of the entire evening. Not that you shouldn't use it for understanding yourself psychologically and spiritually and integrating yourself and moving to higher levels of awareness through understanding character type. But there's other things as well, and we need to fit it into a larger context. That's all. Yeah. Yes? Oh. Is that allowed? Can the camera woman ask a question? Okay. Yeah.
It's on now? Okay. When you first pointed out the circle and you started at 9 and then went around 1, 2, 3, that doesn't necessarily mean that because you're a 1 that you're like earlier in the entry into evolution. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Just because you're a 7 or 8 doesn't mean you're...
No. People always ask in a workshop, if we combine the Enneagram with, let's say reincarnation theory, am I always the same type, life after life? And we don't believe that that's true. We think very old souls are able to understand all types of people precisely because they've been all types of people. However, we have to differentiate between the Enneagram of character type and other ways to use the diagram. And again, I point you to Enneagram studies by John Bennett, or the Intelligent Enneagram by Anthony Blake, or the Gurdjieff materials, because in addition to the 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7 sequence, there's a reason why it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 this way, right? And points 3 and 6 are special. These are what Gurdjieff called shock points. Shock points. These are where energy comes into the system to keep it going in a straight line so that whatever you initiate through an act of will and purpose up here eventually reaches fruition over here. So there's a whole parallel understanding and practice of the Enneagram that doesn't have to do with trying to find out, are you a 4, a 1, a 7, or a 9? All right. This gets really into the occult or esoteric Enneagram, which is how to work with creative energy to make things happen in the world. How many of you saw the new movie The Secret? It's Ashland. Yeah, look at that. Oh, incredible. Like 90% of everybody already. My girlfriend and I just saw it on DVD the other day and were blown away by it. I mean, that really is all about spiritual law, especially the second law of attraction, right? The second hermetic axiom, like attracts and cures like, and how our thoughts are powerful, and we open up through intuition, we sense divine ideas, which I'm about to mention now, the holy ideas, right? And then we develop thought forms. From an esoteric perspective, then you cloak it in astral matter or emotional energy, and eventually it precipitates down to the physical plane. That's a treatise on white magic in Alice Bailey, for those of you who want to know about that. So there's a lot of magical theory and practice in the Enneagram. I don't want to get into it much now because it, could easily spend a whole weekend talking about it. Anytime, but I will say this, let's combine knowledge of the movie The Secret with the Enneagram. Anytime you initiate a project, an action, a goal, through an act of will and intention, which is up in here, life will present you with certain hazards or obstacles. There's many ways to talk about it, but there's a certain chaotic randomness, although ultimately it's not random, I know that, but a certain kind of chaotic unpredictability about the way a sequence of events unfolds in time and space. In other words, based on your level of understanding, your soul perceptivity, the amount of will you can invest in a project, your ability to envision the end result, all of that coupled with what the environment throws at you will determine whether what you initiate actually, bears fruit, right? And, The Secret talked a lot about that. Be careful what you think about, what you put out, because you'll magnetically attract it eventually. Well, the other side of that, though, which they didn't talk about much in the movie, is how many times we would like to create something in our lives for ourselves, for other people, and it doesn't happen, at least in the short term, right? Well, why is that? And why are some people more powerful at creating what they want? You think of somebody like Oprah or Tony Robbins, and then some people seem relatively weak and powerless. Well, there's karma, there's ego strength, there's a lot of explanations. But what the Enneagram says is that in a creative cycle, there's two places in a cycle, and actually a third up here, where you need a little shock. You need a new boost of awareness coming from outside the closed loop of the system that you're dealing with. It's very hard to put this in words, but we all know this. You're going along. You could get sick. You could forget what you want, what your goal is. A bigger priority could temporarily arise in your life. A loved one could pass away. There's a million things that arise in life, which ultimately is just an externalization of our consciousness and our karma, that could derail us from where we want to go. So the Enneagram's of process, right? I told you outer, inner, and secret, and the secret is about the flow of energy in the diagram, has a lot to say about that. That also is not talked about very much in Enneagram books, except in the more Gurdjieffian, Uspensky, and some of the other esoteric currents in 20th century literature on the Enneagram. So I can't say much more about that tonight, but there's a lot in there for you to think about. And I've certainly been working with it in my own life the last few years. I did what everybody did. I came to the Enneagram. I was fascinated by it. Being a 7, I was fascinated by it. And then I typed myself, and then did what people do, which is went, holy shit. I'm so predictable. Some people call the Enneagram God's wisdom mirror, right? Because it gives you an objective reflection of who you are, and also once you work with it, your approximate level of actual development, right? Not where the ego would like you to be on the spiritual path, but where you actually are in terms of, when Christ said, "You shall be known by your fruits," or "They shall be known by their fruits." How enlightened are your behaviors? Physical, emotional, mental. How integrated are you actually? Well, we're building up a body of knowledge that gives a pretty good objective mirroring of that, especially when you're in a large group. You want to do something amazing, go to the International Enneagram Conference, because we do things like eat according to type. That's really scary. I sat at a table of like 25 sevens a couple of years ago, and we sat next to like 38s, and you really feel the energy come through and refracted through the different character types. You also, if you get a group of 30 people, you get a good sense of who's more on the so-called evolved end of the spectrum, according to knowledge of type, and who's a little bit more fixated or neurotic, or down the levels of development according to Riso and Hudson and other authors. So, yeah, that sort of stuff is very important. Okay, I want to move on. I want to read a quote from Gurdjieff that relates to this and then talk more about mystery schools. This is what Gurdjieff said, you've heard this before, Marla, in Uspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous. Speaking in general, it must be understood that the Enneagram is a universal symbol. right? All knowledge can be included in the Enneagram, and with the help of the Enneagram, it can be interpreted. And in this connection, only what a man is able to put into the Enneagram does he actually know, or woman, that is, understand. For the man who is able to make use of it, the Enneagram makes books and libraries entirely unnecessary. That's bad news for the head types. Everything can be included and read in the Enneagram. A man may be quite alone in the desert, and he can trace the Enneagram in the sand, and in it read the eternal laws of the universe. And every time he can learn something new, something he did not know before. That's why, even if some of you have done a workshop or two or more, read 5 books on it, all of that, know your type and working with it for a few years, it really pays to revisit the Enneagram. There's new literature out, new ideas. People have been meditating on it recently. Some wonderful stuff on the internet, some great online articles. These days, just Google Enneagram and then add any other keyword that you want. It's pretty amazing what people are mapping onto it, what they're finding. What they're finding, I believe, are the juicy tidbits that used to be included in mystery school. So I want to sort of circle back to the first 20 minutes of the talk. Again, we have the diagram. We have a bunch of spiritual seekers or practitioners here. I mean, obviously, this is not a normal cross-section of society. First thing is you live in Ashland. Second thing is, you're willing to come out on a Thursday night and talk about how you can grow spiritually, how you can help your loved ones, friends and family, and other people grow. Tuesday. Why do I keep saying Thursday? I don't know. Thursday's more auspicious in India. Thursday's ruled by Jupiter, Guru. Tuesday's ruled by Mars, actually, in astrology. Scary. All right, well, I have strong Mars in my chart. Okay. So some of the characteristics of the mystery schools were that they tended to unite the mystical and occult paths. And many spiritual teachings have said in the last 100 years that, at least in the West, we tended to split these two paths for the last 1,000 to 2,000 years. Right? The mystical path being self-surrender, devotion, things like that. The occult path meaning, bringing our skills to bear in order to master the secrets of the universe, learning how to work with energy and force, bootstrapping ourselves up to higher levels of consciousness through the initiatory process, which, by the way, the initiatory process is always taken on the level of the soul, and by definition has to be conscious. You can't accidentally get initiated, not if it's a real initiation the way that they used to mean, or that we still mean in the esoteric tradition, right? So mystery schools tended to unite the two. They didn't artificially separate the mystical and the esoteric or the occult path. The other thing they tended to do was unite or even melt down the differences in religiosity and spiritual tradition. Right? The mysteries were the mysteries were the mysteries. I'm sorry, it doesn't matter if you're Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Catholic, Taoist, whatever, you're going to die. And when you die, your soul will ascend through planes. And it doesn't matter, what color you are, whether you're American or French or German, whether you're tall or short or male or female, there's certain archetypal processes that happen to the soul. And so mystery schools tended to melt that down. Or synthesize all that, unify it. And the Enneagram does that. Aha, another tip that the Enneagram is about something more than parlor games with personality type. I told you about the number 9 relating to initiation. I showed you the sequence of involution and evolution. But the Enneagram is real Pythagorean, probably in origin in a certain way, but also in terms of phenomenology, right? The numbers, the flow of energy, the outline of the diagram, it cuts across national boundaries, sex and gender orientation boundaries, right? So if it didn't emerge from a mystery tradition, we can apply it towards a postmodern mystery tradition or an Aquarian mystery tradition. And again, I feel, especially having lived in certain kinds of mystery schools, because I lived at Findhorn for 3 years in the 80s. I also spent time in Sai Baba's ashram, Amachi's ashram, the Ramana Maharshi ashram in India, as well as I went to CIIS, which some of you know in San Francisco. That's sort of a half academic, half mystery school place. Not to mention Esalen and Kripalu Yoga and Omega. I mean, a lot of these growth centers are mystery schools in a certain way. Nondescript, slightly under the radar. Even this place, right? This place looks, normal storefront, you come in, I'll check out, I'll get a little ginger candy and check out something. But I know that you've had some amazing teachers here in the last few years, and some amazing energies have come in, and people have opened up and taken it away with them. And then it seems to be the case, at least in early Aquarian times, that these schools arise. Like, Helen Palmer's Enneagram training feels very much like a mystery school to me. We really talk about the difference between the essence or the soul and the acquired personality, right? Do a lot of meditation. But then, we don't even have a permanent structure. We meet in like Catholic retreat centers in Palo Alto, and then it all disappears until the next time we get together again, right? The mysteries tend to be divided up. They're always divided up eventually into the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries. I mentioned this before. And with the Enneagram, we see that as well, with the outer, inner, and secret levels, with the fact that people come to the Enneagram, they study their type, but then they might actually get into the flow of energy. Also psychodynamics, the energy, where you go under stress with the Enneagram, what happens when you relax and go receptive. And eventually Enneagram work is worthless without a lot of meditation and self-observation practices, which we do in our workshops. Can't do it in 2 hours, but when we have a day or 2 days, there's always 2 or 3 meditations a day where we practice what Helen Palmer calls cultivating awareness separate from type, right? And then learning to place awareness or place attention on the different, at least the lower centers of intelligence, maybe open up to the higher centers, tracking where, because, does everybody know the 3 laws of magic, the 3 Hermetic axioms? What's the first one? Has anybody studied magic or? Yes. First one, as above, so below, the law of analogy or correspondences, which relates to the first ray. The first ray, if you study theosophy, would relate to, up at the top of the Enneagram. Second law is the law of like attracts like, or like cures like. That's the second law of attraction, which would relate to sexuality as well, and all of the things that attract complements or opposites. And then the third is energy follows thought or attention, right? So that relates to the third ray of intelligent activity, right? Second ray, love, wisdom. All of that gets mapped onto the Enneagram too. Okay, I want to share with you I'll put this up real quick. People always say, what do I do when I know my type? How do I enter the Enneagram system? Well, again, this is the third Hermetic axiom. Energy follows attention, changes with situations. Without tracking where we place our energy, it's hard to actually create anything new. This all requires self-observation practice. Usually, since it's like, I don't know about you, but when I was in 5th grade, nobody taught me high-level meditation and self-observation in my school in Santa Barbara, California. This is why people go to mystery schools. They learn sacred psychology, and they learn techniques like meditation and visualization and where we place our attention. The Enneagram's brilliant because it shows you where you should place attention, what's likely to come up on your radar screen according to type, at least on the level of the body, mind, and normal daily interactions. And then finally, the self-observation can never become habitual. Gurdjieff talked a lot about conscious effort, conscious suffering. That we have to make effort in spiritual life. Otherwise, the path of least resistance, like the Buddhists say, it's easy for water to flow downhill, but it's much harder to push it back up. And creating bad karma is easy. It's just sort of like the flow of our samskaras and vasanas downhill. So, we can't wake up and become non-habitual by engaging in habitual anything, including self-observation. Okay, I'm going to skip to something. Actually, I'm going to go here first, and then we're going to talk about the core of the Enneagram types and my contribution to the Enneagram working with the intersection of the Enneagram and esoteric studies. Many of you in the room probably already know this. Each type has a mental preoccupation, or what we call the fixation, or Gurdjieff called it the chief feature. And it's like a false belief or a cognitive error at the center of the psyche. It's like the grain of sand in an oyster, and the character type sort of accretes or secretes around it, okay? Now, I'm not going to have time tonight to go over the 9 fixations or chief features, but you can find them in any Enneagram book. And really, your type is defined by your chief feature, your fixation, as well as the corresponding divine or holy idea, which I'll talk about. So each type then has a higher mental quality or holy idea. It's actually not a lower mental quality. It's divine energy. It's like a packet or configuration of divine energy that you're being receptive to because you've relaxed through the lower mind. I know we're getting very theosophical here, very esoteric, but we say idea because we don't have any other word for it. But it's actually a good word. It goes back to the Greek word eidos, which means image of. So it's an image of something coming from the higher worlds. It's what happens when we open up through our fixation. And each type has a habitual emotional response or a passion. Okay, passion, the Christians sometimes called it a vice. So these are things like anger, gluttony. These are the 7 cardinal sins. Right, +2. So lying, pride. Well, it's anger, pride, lying, envy, greed or avarice, fear or cowardice, gluttony, lust, and sloth. Everybody loves that. Sloth. Say that word, sloth. Doesn't that make you, it feels like you're just melting into a couch and you're eating comfort food and watching television and just falling asleep into blissful oblivion. It means sort of kind of like an emotional inertia and laziness. Okay. And then each type has a higher emotional quality or virtue, but that's not really an emotion either. When we mean emotion, we mean unconscious energy flowing through the lower threefold personality. Virtues really aren't emotions. They're qualities of spirit refracted through the heart center. Okay? Sandra Maitri makes this point in her wonderful books. You know, some of you have read The Enneagram of Passions and Virtues and The Spiritual Dimension of the Enneagram. Really good books by this author. Okay, we don't list the body because this is another characteristic of mystery schools. You know, in the West, since the rise of science, we tend to reduce everything down to the lowest possible level and then work our way back up. Sociology, biology, empirical science, psychology works with the observable. And then if you're lucky, you might get to qualities and energies that are, you know, resonating on higher levels. In sacred psychology, right, we always start with the abstract, the general, the universal, the invisible, the higher, and then we work our way down to the particular. Absolute law of occultism, esotericism, sacred psychology. You always start with the cosmos, divinity, spirit, the absolute, the universal, and then you track how it precipitates down into the lower worlds and eventually creates all of this. That. Okay, so the same thing with looking at the Enneagram from a spiritual perspective. We focus on the type. We focus especially on the holy idea at the center of type, but how that gets blocked, and then instead the fixation tends to arise in consciousness. Okay? We actually believe that your type comes from being extra sensitive to the particular holy idea connected to your type. That was the ancient teaching. You come in trailing clouds of glory from God who is our home, and you know, most people, I mean maybe not some bizarre serial killer, I don't know, but most people have a kind of spiritual receptivity that's extra strong in the area of one essential quality, one aspect of spirit, let's say. Because you're so open to that, and the environment, the holding environment in your family and the surrounding, you know, society is not perfectly transparent and enlightened, it's going to shut you down. And your earliest and deepest wound will be will become evident because you no longer have an easy and direct access to being or spirit through your holy idea. The holy ideas are gateways, or Helen calls them gateways to being, I think. Right? It's not that there aren't other gateways, but eventually we constellate a character type, which sort of, hems us in a bit. It's a little bit of a body prison, in the Gnostic sense. Well, the good news is we also have certain doors, right? This room is a prison in a certain way, but there's 3 exit ways, right? There aren't more than 3 right now. You'd have to demolish it and do something different. But there's 2 major exit ways, right? Well, each of the character types have exit ways. And the exit ways are the virtues and the holy ideas. And if we open up through being receptive and, through grace, because these things can only be received on the, given, we believe, they're graces in the Catholic sense, then enlightened behaviors follow. That's why we don't spend too much time talking about the subtypes and the enlightened behaviors. We try to focus on, like the Buddhists do, right attitude, right livelihood, meditation, cultivating good qualities. These are all connected to the lesser mysteries, right? But then eventually, the divine energies start pouring in and we start acting with more wisdom and compassion, more loving kindness, maybe even develop some higher powers that we can use in service of other people. So again, for those of you who don't know, I know most of you in the room know, the 9 passions or vices: anger, pride, deceit, envy, avarice, cowardice, gluttony, lust, and sloth. Those are the 7 cardinal sins of Pope Gregory the Great, for you religious studies scholars. 5th century, I think. Plus points 3 and 6. After you discover your type, you'll discover that this is your driving emotional energy or habit. And part of the Enneagram practice is making that conscious and learning to relax through it through self-observation and developing certain kinds of interrupt practices. And then these are the antidotes. Anger goes to serenity, pride to humility, lying or deceit goes to honesty, veracity, envy or longing goes to equanimity or balance. Avarice or greed goes to a certain kind of non-attachment about the way energy flows in and out, right? So you're not hoarding. Courage, obviously, is the antidote to fear or cowardice. Sobriety, kind of groundedness for 7s rather than spending your time with a feeling of deprivation and gluttony. Innocence is sort of this quality of childlike openness and tenderness, sensitivity that antidotes this big lustful energy of an 8. And right action antidotes, what was the word? Sloth. People love that word. Some of those medieval words are great, It also conjures up the image of that really ugly animal that crawls out of trees at 2 in the morning and eats your cat. So that's on the emotional level. On the mental level, we have what are called the fixations, or again, Gurdjieff called them the chief features. These are more subtle. And again, Enneagram practice relates to the mystery schools in the sense that a lot of meditation and self-observation is necessary because we're not used to focusing on these things. We tend to focus on really gross objects of attention, like how to drive our car properly so we don't kill ourselves, and cleaning up our kitchen at the end of the day so we don't wake up with dirty dishes, and going to work and doing whatever tasks necessary to earn a living, right? Again, education for what Helen calls the inner observer, or I like to call the soul, means learning to retroflect awareness back to internal processes at least as much as what goes on in the outside world, which means sensations, feelings, thoughts, subtle thoughts, patterns of thoughts, and at a very deep level, the structures out of which the patterns come. And I often say this in my workshops, a really bad therapist focuses only on individual symptoms, unless it's a crisis. A better therapist or healer focuses on patterns, right? a really good healer, a shaman, a master transpersonal psychotherapist or something, focuses on the source, the origin of the patterns themselves, which we could call a certain kind of psychic structure out of which all the manifestations arise. And that's where the Enneagram is brilliant. It shows you that structure. I can't prove it to you. You need to study the books, do workshops, watch some movies, go to a conference, type yourself, and work it through. But I'm here to tell you, I've been studying this for almost 20 years, and it seems to be objective fact that these configurations of energy exist. So the fixations here, anger held in the mind as resentment, pride held in the mind as flattery, right? Lying or deceit held in the mind as a kind of vanity. These are just names. I mean, we could use slightly different names. We're trying to get a sense of what's going on. What false belief is, is the ego entertaining, which then serves to buttress up the ego even more, that prevents a certain kind of openness to reality as it actually is. Melancholy or dissatisfaction for 4s, kind of stinginess or contraction of the mind for 5s, withholding, contraction, doubting mind for 6s, planning mind for 7s, vengeance meaning a certain quality of anything that feels hurtful or makes you feel like you're betrayed and your boundaries are being invaded or manipulated. The mind of an 8 will tend to flip it around and push back. That's what vengeance is, right? And indolence is a kind of a darkening or laziness of the mind. Okay? I know I'm going really fast. Holy ideas then, there's many names for the holy ideas as well. The holy ideas, perfection, there should be holy or divine in front. Perfection, freedom, love or hope, source or origin or beauty, omniscience, some people call it holy knowledge or holy transparency, like Einstein, grokking the theories of relativity. Faith is when the mind stabilizes in the presence of fear and insecurity. Wisdom or holy plan, surrendering into the divine plan rather than using the ego to manipulate reality to give you what you want. Truth, which is ultimately the truth of the interconnectedness and unity of everything. So there is no, abuser and abused. There's no need to hit back with vengeance. And then I like presence for point 9. Some people say will, some people say love. I actually think presence, like the Dalai Lama. They even call him Kundun, which means the presence. That's the holy idea. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with in the next 5 to 7 minutes, then we'll have a few questions and try to wrap up at about 9 o'clock. I've been doing a lot of study that's been integrating this understanding, which you can find in any good Enneagram book, with what's called the antakarana or antakarana in esoteric studies. Okay? And sometimes it's called the rainbow bridge. And what this is, if you study, let's say Alice Bailey's a good place to study this, but Rudolf Steiner and Blavatsky and others talk about it. At a certain point in the spiritual journey, there's enough disidentification with form that you start becoming aware of awareness. And you start using consciousness to expand consciousness, which again relates to initiation as a graded series of expansions of consciousness. And part of that process is building the rainbow bridge of awareness, which you can visualize it as a line of energy or awareness that connects up the lower threefold personality, right, which would include your Enneagram type, right, the 3 lower centers of intelligence that we experience so-called outer reality, right? Any of you see What the Bleep Do We Know? Well, it appears that there isn't even any outer reality, right, because everything gets mediated through our consciousness. So there's a line of there's a line of awareness that once you start to hook it up, creates continuity of consciousness, the ability to, have lucid dreams and die consciously, sleep consciously, develop higher faculties such as telepathy, clairvoyance, the things that relate to Atma, Buddhi, Manas, the three faculties of the soul, right? The spiritual triad we talked about. So what the first move in this is relates to the Enneagram and the holy ideas. This is what I lectured on 2 years ago at the International Enneagram Conference. So on the level of the soul, you have this thing, again, we call it the spiritual triad, which is Atma, Buddhi, Manas. Any of you ever study the Michael teachings? I bet some people, the Michael teachings, right? The Michael teachings, not Archangel Michael, but Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough and all those teachings. This was channeled in the 60s and 70s, and a lot of talk about the higher emotional, higher mental, higher body centers. Okay? So we're linking up the higher centers with the lower, the lower centers. Well, and what the occult or esoteric teachings say is that in our constitution, there's a natural gap between the lower mind and the higher mind, which then opens up into the intuitive faculties and the upper worlds. Or, I'm using this, there's 10 minutes. I'm using this imagery, but we could also use, imagery that goes internal as well. We could use depth imagery, not just vertical, that way. So there's a gap, and this gap relates to the fixation, which is sort of like a knot in the lower mind that occludes the light of spirit, that blocks higher energies from fully incarnating all the time in a powerful, open, transparent way, right? So that we're much more lit up and radiant than we are. I'm not saying all of you, right, all the time. But I don't know if any of you have ever been around any great saints, but they glow, man. I'm going down to see Amachi next weekend in San Francisco, and Mother just radiates, and so does Sai Baba, and some of you might have been with Muktananda and some of the other teachers. There's a whole hierarchy of being where some people are pretty endarkened, and other people just like a million watt bulb, right? And some people are 60 watt bulbs. Well, hooking all this stuff up tends to light us up. And the sequence of the mysteries was, people would go lifetimes and not encounter higher spiritual teachings, then they would, but then they had neurotic quirks. Traditionally you would enter an ashram or something, a Zen monastery, and you'd have to clean toilets for 5 years and purify your character. You had to build character, purify character, build character. We don't know if they had the Enneagram information, but the Enneagram is quite useful for understanding what's the quickest and best way to get a handle of all the neuroses and fixations that prevent us from being able to handle all of this light and love, embody it, transmit it, radiate it. So I think that the holy ideas, this is just the name you're going to see in Enneagram books, according to type, the holy idea, if you can contact it and be open to it and incarnate it, can help to cultivate the antakarana. There's different translations for that. A really good one is just sort of like an inner spiritual function. Anta can mean inner in Sanskrit, right? This, by the way, is different than what's called the Sutratma, which means thread soul. You might have heard this term. And the difference is very, very easy to understand. The thread soul is what comes from the monad or the divine spark and incarnates finally into form, comes in through the heart, and it's what keeps you in the lower worlds, right? It also relates to the silver cord. Those of you who've seen Shirley MacLaine, Out on a Limb, astral traveling. I'm sure you've all astral traveled here, things like that. When your silver cord's cut, all those bodies that are not part of the physical body start to leave, right? So the Sutratma, the thread soul, is very different. So you can visualize it as like incarnating downwards into form and then developing a causal body that reincarnates and all of that. The Antakarana is built. You have to build it. You have to do conscious spiritual work. All right? There's an occult saying, personality is mother of the Christ. It's a beautiful occult saying. Personality is mother of the Christ. Christ being the indwelling logos in the heart, right? The God within. So in order to realize the God within and experience that radiation of divine energy without going crazy, without having a breakdown, meltdown, or, there are people who contact these energies and then they get sick and die, or they end up in a mental institution. So, we want to do the character building purification that the Enneagram can help us with. But then there's a lot more work to do. And I think the Enneagram connects very strongly and clearly with some of the teachings that used to be given out in the ancient mystery schools. It's just, you're not going to end up going to a temple anymore, right? You're not necessarily going to go to a fixed structure. You're going to meet with a bunch of people. You're going to talk about the Enneagram. You're going to talk about meditation, practice meditation. Do things like that. Hash out ideas. Do some practices. And then go have experiences, and then come back and talk about them with other people and try to get them validated and stay sane in the process. So I wish I had another few hours to elaborate this, because I have a lot more information on it. Let me see if there's anything else, and then I'll have 5 minutes of questions. Oh, let me read you. Let me read you a definition of the holy ideas, if I can find it. Okay. I can't find it easily, so I won't. Questions? Can we have the mic? Does anybody have any questions before we wrap up? Yes.
Several times you've mentioned, or in passing, a reference to astrology. Is there a link, either by houses or planets?
There have been a lot of attempts to link. I don't know how successful they've been. There's certainly one-to-one correlations are not possible. But, we believe that most people who are 8s, for example, that have big, strong energy, probably have a strong Mars in their chart. People who are mental types, we'd expect Mercury to show up powerfully somewhere. But I don't think they can be correlated one-on-one. In fact, I don't even think it's particularly useful at this moment in time to do it, but that's just me. Yeah? Any other questions? Where'd it go? Yes?
I was just wondering how, not that it's all important or whatever, but how do you know, how far back in history this...
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah.
It's on, I think.
Yeah, I was just interested in finding out how old or how far they know this goes back in time.
The only thing we know for certain is that Gurdjieff claims to have found it sometime around between 1908 and 1912 or something. And he claims to have found it in a remote monastery in the Pamir Mountains of Afghanistan, and where a secret band of initiates were called the Sarmun or Sarmuni Brotherhood, according to Gurdjieff. They had the diagram and they were using it. But we don't know how they used it. And Gurdjieff himself was rather secretive about how much he knew. Yeah. So the knowledge of the Enneagram went into Gurdjieffian work groups for decades and was still kept very secret. Yeah.
And then another thing I just thought of, it's not really a question, but when you were talking about how eating together and, you had 38s by you, and bunch, 37s at your table and all that stuff. I was wondering what maybe effect it would have, or if at one of these conferences, say if you laid people out like a pattern, laid the Enneagram out on the floor and had like 31, and had each person like 30 of each in each position.
We haven't done that, but one of the most powerful things to witness, I think, in any spiritual group, is to see one of each of the 9 types, people who know their type and are definitely that type. And we do it 2 ways. We do what we call 9-point panels, where you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lined up. Or maybe they're grouped 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1. And then you have somebody interview them according to type. Even more powerful, which doesn't happen that often, is to take one of each of the 9 types and actually lay them out in a circle, have them stand in a circle according to how they're embodying their archetypal energies. And then, meditate together, chant together. Gurdjieff actually apparently danced the Enneagram. So there was mudras, there were body postures. I don't know what they are, but let's say for a 1, it was something, that incarnated ethical perfection and integrity and that sort of propriety and rectitude that 1s are famous for. And 8s maybe, and 2s maybe, what would the 2 be? I don't know what they were. Yeah, Mother Teresa, probably a hand on the heart. Whatever it was, 5s, the thinker. And then they would they had postures that would help to incarnate the types, and then they would move according to the lines of the arrows. So they wouldn't just embody the type-related energetic structure, they would embody the transformations from type to type. So you could see how energy moves in the macrocosm as well as the microcosm, as well as the psychodynamics of the individual types. I've never seen that. I think we nearly did it at the international conference 2 years ago, but we did other kinds of, Gurdjieffian movements. I think it'll come back eventually. We don't know how much Gurdjieff actually learned and how much he intuited himself. He was an 8 and rather secretive about, he liked to control things. 1 or 2 more questions and then we'll stop.
Reading 2 books about the Enneagram at the moment. One of them is Sandra Maitre's Passions and Virtues. And I couldn't figure out, because my particular type, I can identify with a great deal of it, but part of it I could not identify with at all.
Yeah.
And I went to a person who actually gives workshops on the Enneagram, and he started questioning me about, well, how do you feel? If you don't feel that way, what do you feel? And I hadn't even gotten to this part in the book and found out that apparently one can transmute those passions into virtues, because the reason I couldn't identify with a passion is because somehow, unbeknownst to me, it became a virtue,
Right.
which, because I knew nothing about these. So I guess the question is that sort of something that one can work with to if you know what the passion or fault or whatever it is to try, or just eventually through living and meditating and doing your thing, you will eventually.
Well, what we find is people who are younger or who haven't done a lot of work on themselves generally come to type through the passions, the fixations, the defense mechanisms or basic fears, which I didn't put on the board today. However, people who are a bit older, who've done work on themselves and are manifesting their virtue or holy idea, they may come to type through the divine qualities coming through, right?
I just found that very kind of fascinating. Yeah, I think it's true.
Yeah.
And could I ask one more quick question? Somebody talked about a leg that you, in the Rossi or the other book, about having a leg of some other type. Do you know
A
what
wing.
that, a wing?
A wing.
Okay, wing.
Yeah.
Some part.
Yeah, your wing is, because nothing is static and permanent and spot on in the universe, people rarely, if ever, land just on one type. So you tend to lean to one wing or another. And there's an advanced theory that says the type, so again, we talked about, that there's an energetic creative cycle that goes around from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, up to 8 and 9. So the type structure phenomenologically arises out of a tension between the two wings. So if you're a 6, it arises out of the tension between the, let's say the archetypal energies and issues of 5 and 7. And so you tend to lean, like, somebody asked me my type, and I'm a 7 with an 8 wing, a strong 8 wing, which looks a bit different than a 7 with the 6 wing, right? And most people do have wings. Yeah.
I identify with my wing.
Right. And some people have stronger wings than others. Right. Okay, I've been being given this. What number is this? All right. So thank you very much for coming.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.